What's the most disturbing secret you've discovered about someone close to you? Story 1. After his death, I discovered that my great-uncle was a grand wizard of the KKK. We opened a chest of drawers in the attic and found photos of rallies, lynchings, and cross-burnings in rural Alabama. We were astonished to see the discovery in person and suddenly understood why he had been so negative toward the black hospice nurse who had otherwise been so kind-hearted and caring to him and his family. Edit. Since so many of you keep wanting to call me a racist or say how I am an extraordinary person for burning everything. We decided to burn everything, my family. I was 16 at the time and had no say in what the adults and elders decided, out of intense shame for what we had discovered. We offered a prayer vigil through our local church for those affected by his hatred. Had I been older, I would have taken more devastating pictures and forwarded them to those who could put an end to the victims. By making this post, those who remain in my family will romanticize his actions. For my family, mentioning his name is a huge risk to remain a part of the family and to do their own will. Yes, it seems too late, as all we know is that my uncle was a member of the KKK for an unknown period of time prior to 1950. My family has prided itself on being very tolerant of other racial and ethnic backgrounds. My 7th great-grandfather was a member of the Underground Railroad, and several of my other great-aunts and uncles were key figures in the civil rights movement. They acted destructively, as anyone with such a historical background would do in a moment of shock. You can blame them all you want, but please don't blame me. I have not made any decisions, and it is too late to report anything, as it happened so long ago for me that I have no useful information. But as for how many other Klansmen I saw in that picture, some of their family members must have already provided evidence after their deaths. My uncle was literally erased from family history and his headstone removed. Story 2. Alright, this is going to be a long story and needs a lot of background, along with some ugly things I've learned along the way. About 6 or 7 years ago, I was in a difficult situation regarding housing. I had just learned that housing was prohibitively expensive and in demand in my city, and that a rental agency was renovating the place and evicting me and my former flatmate, whom I hated. I was looking for a new flatmate, and this guy wanted to meet me to see if we could work something out. This guy had seen me at an anime concert, rarely a good start, I know. We chatted and had drinks together a few times. We were friends on Facebook. He was a friend of mine. He was a friend of mine on Facebook. He was a friend of mine on Facebook. He was a friend of mine on Facebook, and he was a friend of mine on Facebook. He was good friends with my best friend. We talked over Chinese food. He told me that he had dissociative episodes and would wake up and not know where he was or what he had done. He said he once woke up with blood on his hands and had no idea how it happened. I smiled and said things like, "Oh, that's not ideal." But inwardly I thought, I would never want to live with a man like that. A few weeks later, some of my friends mentioned the incident that happened with this guy at AnimeCon. Apparently, it is currently under investigation. A few years later, however, I received a message from another acquaintance saying that I should cut off my friends because this man had just been convicted of assaulting a girl at knife point at an AnimeCon. Suddenly, everything became clear. Our mutual friend opened up to me. They had known this guy since their early teens and were really close. When the incident happened, he told them that the girl had made it all up and that he was innocent. They, cautiously, wanted to believe their friend until the trial, so they said nothing to anyone but the authorities during the investigation. When they attended the trial, they were astonished when they were confronted with hard evidence that he was guilty. He was found with a bag containing a knife, rope, and duct tape. It seems that the girl he attacked was not even his intended target, but his target was in fact a woman that one of my friends was dating at the time, whom he believed was seducing him after being hung out to dry for so long. He even said he thought he was going to kill her. I did not know the victim, but I can only imagine the ordeal she went through. Needless to say, learning that one of her best friends from her teenage years was a violent rapist also really upset her friends. We learned firsthand how traumatic, troubling, and complicated such a thing can be. One girl who knew him, who said she couldn't believe he would do such a thing, later received an anonymous death threat because she thought he was denying his guilt. That man is an aberration. He is in jail now and deserves it. Things like this bring out the worst in others. Story 3. My father was in the ER and ICU for 24 hours before he passed away, stage 4 lung cancer. My mother, sister, and I had been texting and calling my father all day with no response. My mom called the hospital and spoke with the ICU nurse who said he was awake and communicating. He passed away very quickly at 3:30 the next morning. We were allowed to be at his bedside, but by then he was no longer conscious, so we said our goodbyes and he breathed his last. That morning, while my mother slept, I had called the cremation service to schedule a pickup of his body at the hospital and to examine the bag of belongings that the hospital had returned to us. His cell phone was in it, and I decided to read all of our texts and comfort him with my last words to him. When I opened his phone, all of our texts were unread. This struck me as very odd, but I figured he must have been in so much pain that he had no strength. I started scrolling through his app and noticed a chat app that I had somehow heard of. I can't remember the name, but it was basically like WhatsApp. When I opened the app, there was only one contact with a woman's name. As I started reading, I realized that my father has been chatting with that girl every hour for the past 24 hours, going back as far as I could scroll. My father called her a princess and told her he loved her. She told him she was worried about him and wanted to know what was going on, why he was in the ER, etc. I scrolled back and realized he was the one with whom I had at least had an emotional relationship. My grief was completely taken over by hurt and anger, and a week later I tracked down the girl and talked to her at DMS and found out she was 19. She was 17 when we met. He was her high school bus driver, and she told me they had been dating for almost 2 years. My father died at 66, but he was dating someone younger than his grandson. I hope it was a happy thing for my father, but it was certainly a silly secret to live with for the rest of his life. A secret that I never got a chance to talk to my father about, and that will forever cast a shadow over my entire relationship with him. I wish I had never even known this secret. Story 4. Last year I was having drinks with my grandparents, and my aunt said it was creepy that they were so devoted to Christianity and Jesus. She was wearing a hoodie that said "Choose Christ" or something like that, and I was confused. My aunt and uncle are both traditionally secular people. Then my grandmother slipped up and said, "I was baptized after I ran over that man." My aunt apparently ran over a drunk on Halloween. He and his friends had jumped in front of a car in costume, scaring people in the Halloween spirit. My aunt couldn't brake fast enough and went through the windshield. She was released as a white woman without being charged with any crime, so a large racial element then became involved. The man who was killed was a Pacific Islander, and they fought hard for justice, but did not get it. It is a terrible situation, and I feel terrible for both parties, and I love my aunt very much. I love my aunt very much. Story 5. Before I answer this, I want to say that this is not my permission to leave Reddit. You must understand that I am CPTSD and have severe memory loss. With that out of the way, let's get to the answer. My mother sat me down at age 16 and told me that she witnessed my grandfather abusing me when I was 2 weeks old. No one knows when it stopped. I was always in a bad mood, suffering from anxiety and depression. She continued to let him raise me, knowing he was a monster. I had all the symptoms, including bedwetting, until I was 13. When I grew up and told people that I felt something was wrong, they said I was an exaggerated child and a liar. I relapsed a few years ago. That's when people started believing me. Honestly, it's been hard, being invalidated and made invisible for the rest of my life, just being really alone, and even now in my 30s, I just feel so lost and completely hopeless. I don't know how to move forward. Sorry for the rambling. I had never written out my feelings before. I feel bad reading it. I will probably delete this as I want to remain transparent, but I have seen others sharing their stories on the forum. Editor, I want to thank everyone. I can't believe so many people reached out to me. Thanks for the awards too. Sometimes it's easy to forget how many good people there are in the world. I thank each and every one of you. I hope all of you are doing the best you can. Story 6. It is not so much a secret that someone confided to me, but rather comment about a certain murder that occurred in the Midwestern United States. My point is that a family member very close to me has consistently and often commented on a certain murder that occurred in the area where they grew up. The killer was caught, but few bodies were found, and I believe the investigation revealed that the victim had been fed to pigs. My family's comments are always vague and neither incriminate them nor add any new information, but they always make me uneasy, not only because they are less consistent in doing so, but because they say it in a serious or hasty tone. To be fair, rumors spread like weeds in rural America. At the time of the murders, a relative of mine was working at a slaughterhouse owned by another family member, another interesting character, a former biker, and he would always tell everyone at the dinner table when he would go into gory detail about the process of disposing of various animals, including pigs. It doesn't help that he enjoyed making everyone uncomfortable. Anyway, these characters have always been into real crime, and I don't think there are many murders in the area where they grew up. Maybe that's why they are so appealing. I just don't get the feeling that they know something and want to share it with us someday. Next time I see them, I'll poke them, edit. For those asking, this post covers the case in question. Story 7. It's not really a secret, but it still shocked me. TW. Child abuse when I was very young, maybe around 8 years old. My mother had a close friend at work whom she called Lisa. Lisa was married to David and is still married. They were about 20 years older than my mother, so they were old enough to have grandchildren my age. My mother used to take me there and let me play with the other kids while the adults did something else. On a few occasions when my parents wanted to spend the night for themselves, they let me stay there. Lisa and David also hosted a small church gathering on Sundays, with David leading the service. My mother and I attended a few of those. About 10 years later, Lisa and David were found to have repeatedly sexually abused one of their grandchildren. Both were convicted and served time in prison. Everyone was shocked because they were typical God-fearing people. The other day, I suddenly remembered them and found a document detailing what had happened. I don't know why I read it, but I knew it was terrible. The reason this stuck with me is that one night I stayed over. When I went to take a bath, Lisa was watching over me and asked if I needed help. I thought that was a little odd because I was definitely old enough to take a bath by myself, but when I said I was fine, Lisa left me alone. I stayed at the home of the two molesters many times and took the same bath in which the crime took place. Did Lisa and David want me to do that? Probably. It really sends chills down my spine. Story 8. For some, it was a very wonderful result, but for others, not so much. I was adopted and told ridiculous and magical stories about my birth parents that, even as a child, I could not believe were true. And at age 57, I learned that I was the result of a college-aged affair between a very serious young Jewish man and a very Baptist young woman. She was taken to a facility for wayward girls to give birth. He followed her many states away and begged her to have me and live with him. But both their families said absolutely not. Jews were not considered white in the mid-60s, and her family most certainly did not want her to marry a non-white. Besides, she was a devoted Christian and didn't want to convert to Judaism. So, I joined another family. I recently found 3 lovely half-siblings, all professional or semi-professional musicians who get along great. My mother died a year before I looked for her, so I never got to meet her. My father is out of the picture and wants to be alone. I am grateful for the love my father gave me. It was enough. Another person in my non-living family was also adopted. She was older than me. She, too, found her mother later in life. She had been in the hospital since birth. She was born with physical, mental, cognitive, learning, and sensory disabilities. And she was raped by a nurse. And she learned that she was the result. The end of her quest is not always happy. Story 9. My friend got terribly drunk and slept with her boyfriend's best friend. Not her boyfriend. She and her boyfriend have 2 children, but this third child looks like her boyfriend's friend, not him. The first 2 children have brown eyes and hair like their parents. The third has blue eyes and ginger color like the other guy. She was a childhood friend of mine, and we rarely saw each other. When she told me what happened, I suggested she tell her boyfriend. I think she was aware of this possibility because she told me when she was pregnant. It was indeed one time. She didn't say anything about being forced or anything like that, but she was the kind of person who couldn't control her drinking when she was a teenager and would get herself into these situations. From what I heard about the situation, they were both incredibly drunk. I won't say anything because they have a weird relationship. I don't know him well, and I don't feel like saying anything would help. We are dating, but we don't act like a couple, and we don't live together. He made a lot of money, but my friend could only wear clothes with holes in them and was struggling to make ends meet. I'm not sure why they are dating, but they are. It's public on his profile, and around the time baby number 3 was born, her boyfriend's dad also passed away. I don't believe her boyfriend is cheating on her. I'm very much against cheating, but I don't feel it's my place to say anything about it, and I haven't had any contact with either of them in the last few years, as the paternity has not been confirmed. But every time I see her, I think of the stories she told me. Story 10. A cousin was wandering through the woods with her son when she came across a hunting stand. She climbed up there and found a pair of binoculars. Sitting straight ahead, she put the binoculars to her eyes and she could see her bedroom window. Let's think logically here. If it was a legal hunting stand, it was closer than 500 feet from the residence and illegal. If it were a peeping Tom, it would be. So, with prejudice, I had to take it down. Shortly after my brother and I visited, she showed us where it was. We broke it down and literally wrapped it around a couple of trees. That free car was completely unusable. The next day, I got an angry phone call. Did you break the hunting stand yesterday? You freak. Yeah, I did. That was your uncle's. My cousin reported it to his family, but they ignored the issue. When I asked my uncle about it, he said it was just an old treehouse there. They didn't care when they were exposed. They were more upset that we had been victimized. Suffice it to say that I have given up on most of that family. Editor, the uncle in question is dead. He died June 16th. Story 11. My aunt was plotting to rape her underage grandson with a cop she met on an online date edit. I thought this would get buried in the other comments, but since so many people want the details, the OP will bring it to you. A first for Reddit, I know. I have 12 aunts, and this one was seemingly the most warm and innocent aunt. Her daughter had a child when she was young, and then her life got so crazy that my aunt took custody of her grandson before he was even a year old. When her grandson was about 9 years old, my aunt left her husband and started dating online. She was talking to a guy who was a cop. We later found out that he befriended a woman with a child and had a history of raping/molesting that child. Anyway, my aunt definitely had issues with men and wanted to feel needed by them, so she went along with many of the morbid things this cop was suggesting she do to her grandson. Would she have actually done it? I think so, but there is disagreement within the family, especially because this aunt is a typical softie. Anyway, the cop was eventually arrested and sent to jail. He was doing this with several women and children. My aunt died of cancer shortly after the verdict. Story 12. When I was in high school, I had a friend with whom I bonded over the emotional pain of the time, although we didn't stay together for long, just a semester or so. Unfortunately, she committed suicide not long after, but years later I heard from her best friend what she was really going through. Her parents divorced because her father came out as gay, and she left home with him because she was also gay, but her family was viciously homophobic toward them. Her own brother spray painted the house with slanderous paint and slashed tires, and her mother pushed her down the stairs at one point, breaking her leg. She also had health problems that contributed to her depression, and one day she decided she had had enough. Almost a year after her death, her brother also killed himself out of guilt. I was told the family was being investigated, and the last I heard was that her mother had started speaking at suicide prevention events. Story 13. When I first started working in tech, I met a super nice guy at a networking event. He had lots of connections and a nice family. Super rich. We eventually became friends, and he became a mentor to me in the industry. I went to his huge new house and met his family. He had the attitude and look of Al Borland in Home Improvement. 4 years later, I was looking at the local sex offender registry map when I was looking for a house. To my surprise, his home P***D. In the early 2000s, he was convicted of cooperating a website selling child pornography. He served 5 years in federal prison. Story 14. My grandfather is a ghost on paper. We grew up knowing that our grandfather had skeletons in his closet. As a teenager, I heard rumors that my grandfather was an expert safecracker. but he never wanted to admit it. In 2016, he told me, as if talking about the weather, that he once sold guns to the IRA. He also told me that he had helped a couple of triads who were hiding out in Jamaica after beheading their opponents and escaping. According to him, they were pretty good guys. It was only about 10 years ago that he stopped sleeping with guns under his bed and making suspicious phone calls in his yard. His grandmother is the only one who knows his real name. No one else in the family knows. I respect him, but he is a mystery to me. Story 15. She has been my best friend for 7 years, and we have literally been through everything together. I moved out of state with my now husband, and she convinced us both to move back near her a year later. We had no connection to the states we tried, so we said screw it, let's go back. She's basically family. We were all very happy to see her again. She came over for dinner almost every night, and we all laughed, talked, and had a blast. It was the best year of my life. Gradually, she began to try to turn us both against each other. Every time we argued, as any couple would, she would text each of us how right we were, trying to instill animosity between us. In my case, she started talking about how she had a plan B for us and that if my husband and I didn't work out, I could move in with her and we could live happily together. With my husband, she started talking about her infertility issues and how she wanted a child just like him, only she needed a sperm donor. This all happened around the same time, and my husband and I found out by comparing emails. She wanted to get his sperm and have a child with me. When questioned about it, she refused to admit anything and became verbally abusive to both of us. She showed up unannounced, banged on our door, and went so far as to demand a place in our home. It was so frightening and caused so much panic that we eventually had to move and change our phone number. I guess I was very insecure because I had never had a friend like her before. But that's my story. My husband and I are getting along great now. Story 16. This may not be the most common answer, but my elderly mother, who lives in another state, lied to me about her health. She was in her 80s because everything seemed to be going well until a friend called to tell me the truth. Turns out she had many bad health conditions. Long story short, she ended up in an assisted living facility. I hear this happens all the time because the elderly don't want to be placed in a home. But in her case, she was literally on the verge of accidentally killing herself or dangerously injuring herself. So having to go into assisted living sucked, but it was necessary if she really wanted to live as long as possible. Besides, that facility was very nice anyway. The moral of this story is that if your loved one is elderly, if you can, don't just take their word for it. Ask them how they are really doing. Story 17. I was good friends with a guy who owned a hobby cafe, basically a place where you could play trading card games, board games, etc. He offered a service for kids every Saturday where they could watch movies on a projector and play Pokemon tournaments. Parents in the area could get their kids out and get their chores done, and about 20 kids would gather there each week. A few years ago, however, it was discovered that his computer had about 1 terabyte of unauthorized CP. According to the news, there was no evidence that he had manufactured it, so at least there was some small hope that the children who attended every Saturday were not being exploited, but the fact that such a thing could be done is frightening. Story 18. A family suicide. My great-uncle died the year I was born. It always hit me. He died young and suddenly. He died young and unexpectedly. He was poisoned by alcohol. I visited the cemetery with my father, who is over 30 years old, and he finally told me the whole story. He was a medical technician. He lost his job due to a chronic illness and soon after divorced. He joined someone else, but was unable to recover from his unemployment and eventually hanged himself. For a long time, I have sold the sight of a severely depressed person struggling with health and family issues, with no help in sight, as an anti-alcohol PSA. Only as a bad self-medication. He spent his last and worst days with heavy drinking. I don't understand the secrecy, whether it is because of the repurposed story or because the whole family is ashamed of the true story. And knowing that depression runs so deep in the family, I find it terribly harmful that even after such a tragedy, they still see the writing on the wall and refuse to acknowledge that the problem is real. Officially, the death was attributed to complications from alcoholism. Story 19. A colleague at work made the front page of a national newspaper for fraudulent credentials. He claimed medical and law degrees, was an Army adjutant, reservist, and was the CEO of a major medical foundation. In fact, he was an Army Reserve Brigadier General, but his credentials and his role in the Heath Fund were built on fraudulent credentials, and he moved from job to job based on these claims. In fact, the only credential he had was as a mortuary assistant. Even his wife did not know this. The fraudulent degree was obtained while he was a recruiter in the Army Reserves and had access to the job application submitted. When he applied for a government job, the recruiter noted several problems. He tried to withdraw his application, not knowing that an application for a government position carried the same weight as a statutory declaration and could not be withdrawn. Everything quickly deteriorated, and he ended up in jail. Story 20. A former friend of mine, let's call him Doug, admitted that he may have killed someone. As I recall, Doug's ex-wife was a drug addict. She got clean and eventually went our separate ways. He moved to California, and she stayed in Florida. When Doug got word that some predatory drug dealer had gotten her addicted again, he conspired with a friend to do something about it. His friend provided him with an alibi by dressing like him and using his credit card in many places. Meanwhile, Doug rode his motorcycle as fast as he could across the country, rarely taking a break. He finds a drug dealer, breaks into his house at night, cuts out his tongue, sets him on fire, and leaves. He did not stay around to see if the drug dealer was alive. He drove back to California. I don't know how much of this is true, but it definitely disturbed me at the time. When I knew him, he had spent years as a destructive alcoholic, although he himself was sober. Story 21. My ex-girlfriend of 6 years admitted that she was not raped. Her identity in life was surrounded by accusations of rape. $15,000 went into her therapy. Every time something bad happened, she blamed it on PTSD. Every time I called my friends, she wanted to get rid of them because of her PTSD. Whenever I went out, she told me to go home because of PTSD. In addition, she faked the trigger. She would get a kick out of seeing a red Corvette because she said the person who raped her drove a red Corvette. Totally crazy. I honestly still get angry and red when I think about it. There are people out there who have been sexually assaulted in real life. Those people are why some people are not taken seriously. Sorry for my rant. Story 22. As an adult, I discovered that my mother did not just leave me one day after work, as I had been led to believe. My mother had been gang raped. They took her purse and said nasty things about the pictures of me that were in it. I was only a toddler at this time. They followed her, they said. When they were done, her stepfather took her to the hospital, where she had to have everything stitched up. During this time, she spent her time in and out of the psych ward. My mother and I still have a volatile relationship for reasons other than this, but I know her better. My mother has had drinking and mental health issues all my life, and I truly believe it is because she never sought proper help for what happened to her. My mother is at the root of my trauma, drinking, and grief, and she is one of the most beautiful souls to ever walk this earth. To clarify, she stayed in my life just as my grandparents raised me. There was so much other drama, but none of it is worth mentioning. Story 23. A few years after marrying my first wife, I discovered that she had been having an ongoing sexual relationship with a cousin before she met me. I could tell by the way they looked at each other around the campfire. Update out of curiosity. I always knew he was her favorite cousin, but I knew nothing about it, nor did I suspect it until we were around the campfire that night. It was just the three of us then, and I have always been good at reading people. She was stunned and immediately admitted. How did you know? I said. Then she said, Oh God. I wonder if anyone else in the family noticed. They had been sleeping and waking for at least 2 years before I met her, but I suspect it was also after she met me. Another fact that was kept from me before we were married was that she was bipolar and untreated. Things took a turn for the better. I was fortunate enough to walk away. I divorced her in 2014. I think her family knows because I told her cousin, the woman who hates her, last year. Story 24. I posted another comment, one about my brother. He is a psychopath. He was raised the best any child could hope for. Mom and Dad doted on my brother. When my brother was born, he was jealous. It was a fun game to poke his eyes out until his little brother cried. It got so bad that my parents locked my brother in his room and spread P*O all over the walls. Cue my birth. He has glaucoma in one eye and serious damage to the surface of his other eye. My parents say, he only poked your brother in the eye, but he admitted to me to my face that he poked me more. According to my ophthalmologist, my eye is really bad, and I have sharp lines and cuts all over my eye. Now I have to use eye drops every day, and one eye is pretty badly damaged. I have glaucoma in that eye. I can't prove that my brother did it, but I know he did it because he asked me directly if it was due to him poking me in the eye. Story 25. Growing up, I had a vague image of my uncle as a disreputable person. At weddings and other family functions, my parents would tell me and my cousins to stay away from him. In my senior year, we had to cut out the newspaper for citizenship class, I don't know why, and I found an article about my uncle's re-entry into Broadmoor Prison. I went home and Googled him and found out he had served time for kidnapping and rape in the 80s. He also once tried to sue the Sun for libel because they published an incorrect article about him. All I know is that he was in a halfway house for a long time, but as far as I know, he was released about 5 years ago. Story 26. My best friend of 25 years, who believes he is a sociopath, proudly confessed it to me. He then gleefully told me that he didn't care about anyone but himself. I immediately recoiled, begging him not to think so, and trying to give him a counterexample. Over the next year or two, as our world became particularly chaotic, I stepped back and began to observe them more closely. Eventually, I realized that they were right. Not only that, but they had been doing SD***D, abusive and very manipulative things to me for decades. They were the worst people imaginable to associate with, take around, try to ruin your life, and turn all your friends against you if you expressed opposition. After a mountain of passive-aggressive attacks, one day I woke up to who they really were and instantly kicked them out of my life. Remember, this was a long, slow build-up. There was a healing spell, which is still ongoing, and many sacred moments in retrospect, but things have been great ever since. It was like realizing that I had been on some sort of slow poison drip for decades and finally pulling the drip out of my arm and stepping into the light. Story 27. My ex-husband sexually molested my stepdaughter, who was with his new wife, and the police and his parents called me about it. We have been divorced for over 8 years. I fled 5 states away in the middle of the night with only a carload of stuff and moved 3 more states away, and he had apparently been writing fake emails to me and literally spying on me with cameras for several years after the divorce to pee off my wife. When I questioned my wife about the cameras and spying, she said she thought it was romantic the way he was pining for me and that he had likened everything to us all along. They had the same theme/color wedding and he got a new tuxedo. She knew everything I liked, had my cookbook, understood my cooking, celebrated my birthday, and tried to tell me we had a lot in common. I met him when I was 14, and he was just turning 17 to 18. He was always manipulative and emotionally abusive, but I had no idea he was so evil and sick. Her daughter, unfortunately, looks exactly like me at that age. Story 28. Perhaps not the most disturbing thing about this thread. However, I recently learned that my siblings and I are the product of my father's second family. Apparently, my father had a first family, and my mother separated him from that family. The oldest son was named Junior, and he apparently died in the 90s, about 10 years after my mother and I started our family. The man I knew, who was a beacon of a righteous and moral life, left his family to start a new family and ran off with a new woman. He never spoke to his parents again. I would never see my parents again. My brother and I became good friends after he found out. But I'm really curious about how much we were duped, and I'm hoping to get a DNA test to see if I have any long-lost half-siblings or cousins. Story 29. My old neighbor's father may have been an **** guy. He had a very old signed, yes, Hitler's, main KMF that was a great red and had a really old picture of Hitler on the page. The inscription in the book was translated as "We will rise. We are the chosen ones." There was also an old photo of Hitler, supposedly his father, dressed as a teenager in an ***I Germany. His son was not far behind, and was very secretly racist. Back in the 80s, I was repairing a telephone for a favor and opened a nightstand drawer to put in some parts and screws for the telephone's base so that parts wouldn't get lost. The screws rolled to the back, and when I pulled out the contents of the drawer to retrieve them, I discovered the book. It was loosely wrapped in a faded scarf. Thinking it odd, I fixed the phone and left the place. I stopped returning the neighbor's favor or contacting him. From then on, he looked at me funny, as if he knew me. I moved shortly thereafter, but never forwarded the address. Yikes. Story 30. My best friend in high school had an older brother who was only a year older than me. I was never a close friend or anything to him, but I always liked him when I was younger in a friendly way. He was always a goofball and always got into trouble as a teenager, but he seemed kind-hearted. He had a serious drinking problem from middle school. I knew he had his demons, but I didn't think he was a bad guy. Well, anyway, after high school, I lost touch with the friend for a few years. But when we ran into each other again some time later, we played catch-up for a long time. As we talked, I couldn't help but notice that she never mentioned her brother at all. That was odd, given that her brother had always been present in her life. So I asked about him. Apparently, her brother had raped a 12-year-old boy when he was in his mid-20s. The boy's family found out and sued him. I was really shocked. I knew he had serious emotional problems, and I knew he was involved in substance abuse. At best, I imagined he would be in and out of jail for minor drug-related offenses. Or maybe he would go to jail for a drug-related felony. I had no idea that his life would take this turn. A friend of mine said she thought his problems made it very difficult for him to have healthy relationships with people his own age. He said he feels safer dating much younger people. After he was charged, she said he went completely to pieces, as if he were breaking up with another adult. It wasn't the charges that bothered him. He took this girl seriously as a boyfriend and didn't want to lose her. That doesn't make whatever he did any less scary. What was just shocking was how twisted this man I grew up with was. All this time I thought you knew the man. Story 31. I have very little interaction with my family. They are worthless to me. I am only close to my mother, father, and one brother. The rest are S***M or people who have no interest in me. I have learned the hard way not to trust people, not to lose money, time, or emotional freedom. From now on it is different. I don't care if I never hear from them. They are worthless to me, and I allowed terrible things to happen to my father, their brother. And when my grandfather died, I allowed the poor treatment to continue, knowing that they hated my grandfather, who is only a son-in-law and half-brother. All of my step-grandfather's property and home ownership was given to my grandmother by my real family to take care of my father. My grandmother died when I was 8 years old, leaving all her property to my husband. When my husband died, the money was given to all of his grandchildren in his will and to his sons and daughters. He did not work and lived off the money. The money for the house was not paid for by my father. It was money left to my mother to care for my father. And I reached out to him to let bygones be bygones. No, you spread hatred, and the money you took was left by my father's real family to take care of him. Your father was just a usurper and stole his father's inheritance. Story 32. My mother met the woman when she was attending college as an older student. The two became good friends. My mom and I had just moved to town and didn't know anyone, so it was nice to get to know someone. She had a daughter about 10 years older than me and an adult son who was mentally disabled. We spent a lot of time with them and often stayed at their house. About a year later, we moved to the country, and I lost touch with her. A few years ago, someone brought it up, and Mom told me that her friend had been really badly abused in the past. He gaslighted her, beat her, mentally abused her, and did things like He convinced her to have sex with her mentally handy **D son who couldn't speak. I don't understand. Why did my mom feel the need to tell me this? I feel sick just typing it out now. Oh my God. Story 33. My mother returned to China to have an abortion when I was about 4 years old. My parents hoped I was too young to remember, but I did. I remember my mother visiting the doctor many times at the time and having ultrasounds and other tests. Then my mother returned to China for a few months. My father and I were the only ones left in the U.S., and upon her return, she stopped talking about it at all. I asked her where my sister, who was supposed to be born, was, but she just said something like she was gone. When I became a teenager and learned about sex, pregnancy, abortion, etc., I began to suspect that she had had an abortion. Just recently, over 30 years later, I asked my uncle about it, and he said it was all true and that she did have an abortion. We lived in a very conservative state. My parents were poor immigrants, living on my father's meager graduate school stipend, and could not afford an abortion. The reason she had an abortion was because the child had so many birth defects that she would not have survived anyway. Story 34. This is not a disturbing story, but it is equally shocking. For as long as I knew my great-grandfather, until I was about 8 years old when he died, he never talked about his time in the military. He served in World War I when he was 17. He lied about his age. I knew he had served and that he was in a wheelchair because of the wounds he received. He never talked about it. When he died, my parents were helping him sort through his belongings and found his Victoria Cross, the highest decoration of the British Army for gallantry in the face of the enemy. My parents did a little research and learned that my small, mild-mannered great-grandfather had participated in the Battle of the Somme, crossed the summit, turned to check on his comrades, and was shot through both legs sideways by a single bullet. At the same time, his companion was also shot in the throat. My great-grandfather crawled back to the British trenches with his crippled body, dragging his wounded friend as bullets and artillery whizzed overhead, both of them surviving. He was awarded a VC for this feat, but kept quiet about it to his wife, children, grandchildren, etc. I guess he didn't want to do what anyone, or most people, would do for a friend and receive the fanfare and accolades. And they didn't want to be reminded of anything related to that war. Young people back then were made of different stuff than people are today. Story 35. My father betrayed my mother, whom she did not know, and my brother's mother. They married and had me on their first wedding anniversary. My father began having affairs with several women, and even when visiting my mother, my grandmother, who is dying of cancer, he met and flirted with several women, and my mother and I returned to our home state while my father buried my mother. After he left my mother, he remarried in Mexico to someone the same age as my brother, his first marriage. He died of a heart attack on the freeway in 2011. My brother and I had to pick up his belongings and went through his cell phone. And you know what? He was having an affair with his now wife who lives in Mexico. The phone number had names like his boss and lawyer. We looked through the messages and were not surprised. So we erased everything from his phone. This man was a player until the day he died. He was a **** bag, but from what I've heard, his past was pretty awful. But that's another post. Story 36. This sounds like a midday TV show, but I hope this all makes sense. Names have been changed. My mother and father have been married for over 30 years. 10 years ago, when I was 27, I learned that my mother married a man when she was 19 and that she had a daughter with him. That daughter was my half-sister Claire, whom both my parents had pretended did not exist, and I had no idea of her existence. At the same time, I learned that my oldest brother, Sam, was actually my half-brother. My oldest brother had left home when I was very young, and I don't have many memories of him, but he came back into our lives when I was 16. My mom and dad were always extra critical of him, so it was understandable that he never wanted to talk to me again. I only found out about this because my half-sister contacted him on Facebook and clearly told my other brother, Peter, that she was his half-sister. My brother was ticked, which resulted in my father and mother telling us. They were trying to protect us, apparently. I'm sure they didn't mean to tell us. Mom casually mentioned that Sam was also the son of her first husband. I said, "Wait, Sam is my half-brother?" She was in tears, and I just consoled her at the time, but honestly, the last 10 years have been especially hard. I hate my parents, and I don't trust them at all. Claire has lived with Nan since she was 4 years old, and when Mom got together with Dad, Sam tolerated her, but Claire hated her. I ran away from home several times until Nan took me in. I only met Nan twice in my life. The last time was just before she died. Before Nan passed away, I did not know all of this. My mother had avoided any contact with Nan and my father during my growing up years. My parents wanted to pretend that everything was fine. I never recovered from that. I would get anxious about emails from my mother. I moved 2 hours away and expect my parents to visit me every Christmas and every other month, even though I have been here for 8 years and they have never visited me. I have told almost no one about this, except my therapist, so my heart is racing as I post this. Thanks to anyone who has read this far. Story 37. Finally, I can post this story in here. My now husband, engaged at the time, and I were teachers and spent 2 years in the Alaskan bush and countryside. We became good friends with an older single guy who worked with us. We would often go out to dinner, go hiking, or use the school Honda to shoot his gun collection at the local beach. No animals or local critters were harmed because of our rural lifestyle. He was like an uncle to us. We even stayed in his Airbnb/spare bedroom in his house in the city on vacation. Now, in my second year of teaching there, he brought a young woman with him at the beginning of the school year who he said was his niece and wouldn't step out of the house. He told me she was having trouble living with her brother and was taking classes online to graduate, which confirmed it for me and the other women in the village. In the spring, she left the house without the man. It turned out that this girl was basically a minor he had met online, and that her father had tracked her down after contacting a local woman about her situation and had a state trooper escort her home. She had gone missing 8 months earlier. Beginning the following summer, he appeared in court on the matter and also lured another underage girl offline to live with him the following school year. He is now in prison until 2043. Story 38. I have a little side note about my father's life, but I want to share it anyway. My father had a really rough childhood. He was basically the darling child of my grandmother and my real grandfather. He was abandoned at the age of 5. From what I heard, they really loved each other, but my parents were so against it that they even canceled a wedding that was in progress. Anyway, it was the worst. He didn't remember much of his childhood, and even when he tried to remember, he couldn't. At some point, however, he became bitter enough to detest his father, because a few years later, he was returned to his mother's adoptive family and introduced to a new man whom she had already married. Somehow, I don't know how, at some point he heard that his real father was living with his new wife, was rich, and had a new happy family. He was apparently supporting his other children's goals and dreams with both money and love. And all the while, he never reached out to him, never gave him even a semblance of support, and was basically a dead man to him for the rest of his life before that. I couldn't even imagine what he felt during that time. He hated everyone, including himself and his stepfather. He was quite abusive at the time, to the point of pouring boiling water on his own children and most of the livestock he was raising. I don't want to explain too much about what a sick man he was at the time, but you get the idea. Decades later, my father was already an adult. Then one day, I was visiting my mother, helping her clean up, and was about to take something off the top of a closet. An old chest suddenly fell to the ground, revealing a pile of inventory. Inside that chest was a pile of open letters from his own father. Apparently, there was not a month in his childhood when he did not send a letter. How's school? What are you doing this Saturday? Won't you see me? Are you eating well? And birthday cards, Valentine's Day cards, Christmas cards, out of the blue letters. As a matter of fact, my father's father never forgot him and loved him very much. And the sad thing? My father sent money for my father's tuition, gifts, and even an allowance to buy my father what he wanted. She even prepared plane tickets for my father so that he could visit him. And yet, what did Grandma do? What did her own mother do? She hid it and spent the money on herself. She probably spent a lot of that money to support her terrible husband's gambling addiction. My father said he felt his whole world shatter at that moment. But rather it was the fact that he had unwittingly grown up and spent his entire life hating the man who truly loved him. And well, what's even sadder? When my father found out all about it, he went to... My real grandfather was already on his deathbed. Story 39. My mother. My view of my mother changed when she told me about the first time she had sex. She was 8 and the boy was a neighbor, and he was 15. He took her to his room and undressed her. She said it didn't hurt and it felt good, but she definitely had no idea what was happening or what was being done to her. As she described it, even now, many years later, I am not sure if she realized it was a non-consensual act. Because at that young age you can't consent, and if you are not in a state of consent, it is abuse/assault. I was in my late teens at the time, and I don't remember what exactly I said, but it was something like, "I'm sorry you had to go through that. Would you like to talk more about it?" It was something like that. And she said, "No, it's okay. I just wanted to talk to someone. You were the first person I told. I haven't said anything to my dad or my grandma. I never said anything out loud." I think our family had a lot of dark secrets, and we were still living at home at the time and in survival mode. Our family is pretty dysfunctional, but we, my mom, sisters, and I, are now growing up and trying to get out of it. My mom has been in therapy for a little while now, and I hope she is brave enough to share that in her sessions and is getting the care she needs. My mother was abusive when I was very young. That doesn't excuse it, but I can look back on it now with a forgiving eye. This was definitely the first time I saw her from a different angle. Story 40. My relatives on my mother's side of the family have a strange habit of telling funny stories about horrible things that have happened in the family and telling them at family gatherings. Stories like the time my grandfather tried to shoot my grandmother in the living room with the kids, or the time my mother got slapped for calling Billy D. Williams as ***y, have been told at Christmas parties since I was very young. The only things that don't make for fun stories are the ones that no one knows how to handle and just wants to bury. And those are just a few glimpses I've been able to catch. Particularly memorable was my grandmother divulging that my grandfather was really proud of being in KK and participating in lynchings and being good at it. Or that the only reason I grew up meeting my grandfather while none of my cousins ever met him was because he knew where my mother lived and the other kids did not. His house and what happened there was extremely strange now that I think about it. It was on a weird level, like being in a dollhouse made of repurposed driftwood with his new wife's mute grandchildren playing with dead mice in Barbie clothes. Story 41. His mother was a murderer. This is a crazy story, but it is true. When I was dating Jay for a bit, he told me about his mother, who was alive at the time. She had a lot of kids, so she used to hire babysitters. She was 16 years old. They had a very 1950s style marriage. Everything was very uptight between the parents, but the kids were wild. Their parents allowed any kind of shenanigans. One day the mother disappeared off the face of the earth and somehow took her husband's gun. She had children to feed and school to go to. I think the burden was too much for her. So I finally got in touch with her. She was on a cross-country car trip with a 16-year-old girl who had a baby. They were in love. My father was a quiet man. He didn't know what to do. One day, Mom came back. She just came back and everything resumed as if nothing had happened. Dad and Mom didn't talk about anything. Detectives came to the house and asked a lot of questions. A 16-year-old babysitter was found dead in the desert area where she was traveling. She had been shot and cruelly dumped. The police linked Dad's gun to the shooting. Everyone knew that Mom had shot her. The detectives knew it too. But nothing happened, and it was never brought up. This is one of the craziest stories I have ever heard. Story 42. During summer vacation 2010, my brother and I went to stay with my grandmother, my father's mother. 2 weeks after we returned home, my grandmother called my mother and told her that I had stolen $7,000 from her safe, and she wanted the money back. Obviously, I had no idea what she was talking about. Thankfully, my mother defended me and said that she didn't think I stole it, that she had no proof that I did, etc. My grandmother would not budge and said I must have done it. I was not allowed to go back to her house, and she did not want to see me anymore. Grandma never spoke to me again until 2017, when I gave birth to my first child. I learned earlier this year that, shockingly, it was my brother who took it. And yet, my brother was never charged, and he and my brother remained close for 7 years when he refused to talk to me. Here is the real family secret. Grandma learned the truth about the money in 2011, less than a year after it went missing. My grandmother never confronted my brother, never disowned him, kept me away from him for another 6 years, and to this day has never apologized to me or even talked to my brother about it. So for a total of 12 years, my entire paternal family knew it was my brother. Everyone knew I was ostracized from my family for no reason, yet no one wanted to welcome me or apologize. Everyone just. They left the innocent to remain innocent and the guilty to remain innocent. Story 43. Setting the scene and getting into the secret. As a teenager between the ages of 14 and 16, I was always making terrible social decisions, sleeping around, getting into trouble, doing dangerous things, and coping with the repercussions by drinking. These two things compounded and continued to affect my school and home life, and my parents told me to leave home. I was kicked out at age 16 and had to find a job to make ends meet. Completely isolated from my blood relations, I clung to the few people I had left. I ended up bonding with someone I had never really liked before, but had always been a social butterfly. During the next few years as best friends, his single-parent mother was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and passed away. I fed him, gave him as much booze and drugs as he wanted, gave him a place to stay, and under extreme circumstances, when he failed his college entrance exams, I paid his exam fees over and over again until he passed. Shortly after his mother died, I started dating a girl. These two were my heart and soul. Well, long story short, he started driving me around, and when I was at work, the two of us would go for drives. Then me/girlfriend, started going out and apart over and over again, just like Ross and Rachel. I was struggling to juggle work, drinking, life, his support, and overall destruction. Shortly after I started dating her, when he was just a friend, I found out that he emotionally used things I had told him in private and things I could not tell anyone when I was younger to make me look bad. How I had cheated on him, unfortunately, she knew about some of the women I had dated, so he reinforced those details, how I had gotten into fights about drugs and alcohol, how I had put my life in danger. He pressured her to sleep with him, and she took his virginity. Then they continued to see me for a year and drive each other crazy without telling me the whole time. That was my partner and my best friend. I only found out about it when we officially broke up. The shock I felt was so deep and so raw that I spent the next 5 days crying under the covers listening to heavy metal, self-harming, consuming only drugs and alcohol, and on the last day calling my parents, whom I had not spoken to in nearly 3 years. Prick. Story 44. My father hated me with all his heart, but I spent 23 years thinking he loved my brother with all his heart. My childhood and teenage years were brutal. My father only spoke to me when he yelled. We sat across from each other at the dinner table and never made eye contact. In fact, we might talk maybe twice a year, and we lived under the same roof. But he was very close to my brother. I hated my father, and he hated me even more, so I began to hate him. That drove me crazy. My grandmother, who was also my mother and best friend, knew that I was really struggling, and when I was 23, SHE finally told me that he was not my real father. My real father left before I was born, and my mother met that D***K when I was 1 year old. I was both relieved and embarrassed. Because when I was a little girl, many of my friends were always asking me if he was my real father because of the way he treated me. My mother never lied to me about that. People wonder why I have trust issues. Story 45. My youngest brother, by all accounts a sweet, sensitive kid, had signed a virginity pledge with his girlfriend, but it turned out he was having sex with his girlfriend's mother. He called her mother, and after his girlfriend found their bed together, they ran off to get married. He was also kicked out of the army. This was because his girlfriend's father was an army chaplain, pastor, and the army forbade officers from secretly sleeping with another man's wife on base. He was warned about that several times. We found out most of it later because his argument was that he would drop out of high school in his senior year and live with his wife's family until they both turned 18 so they could get married. My parents tried to change his mind and took him to counseling until a counselor had a private session with him. The counselor said he was afraid my brother would hurt my parents or himself, so my parents let him go. A month or so later, he sent a letter saying he never wanted to hear from us again, and a few months after that, things took a turn for the worst. His wife found my brother with his mother, and he was kicked out of the military. When we cleared out his room, we needed the space for the baby. We found a bunch of stuff we thought he had stolen from us, and a letter detailing how much he hated all of us. I recently heard that he works at a home improvement store, is married to my ex-girlfriend's mother, lives with her mother, and is considering electrician school. My parents are shocked but have decided to respect that he does not want any contact. All we have heard about him is on Facebook from mutual friends, his ex-girlfriend, and his mom's friend. Story 46. My cousins moved in with me, my mother, brother, and sister when I was 14 or 15. First one, then my second cousin, and then their stepsister because their father was a scrapper who married an abusive creep. Eventually, the stepsister left of her own volition, and the cousin also left because of the way she treated her sister. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. We then moved out, and I ended up sharing a room with a second cousin who I adored like a sister. Mom found a man, about 10 years later, because we were her priority. He was a lot of fun, and we were around him a lot. He came to see my plays and was accepted by all of you as SC, and I had a bunk bed, double on the bottom and single on top, which was mine. SC used to stay at her mother's house, an alcoholic herself, which we thought was weird, but it was her mother. I always slept in her bed when she was away. I had never had a double bed before, so I always used it. One night, when she was gone, I noticed something stuck in the pillow, and when I reached inside and pulled out the belt, the pillow was still lumpy, and I found a shirt. It was definitely C's. She had written everything in her journal, and I knew I would find the answer there, so I read it. I found out that she had been sleeping with C for months after what Mom had done for her, giving her a new start and hope for the future. She was 17, and he was 41. That was about 14 years ago. They had been together for a long time, but I recently learned that she is now single, betrayed and distraught. He is not single, apparently. My guess is that karma has come around. Story 47. Not a very disturbing story, but still. My grandfather was 19 years old when the **T Union attacked Finland in 1939. He was called up to defend Finland. He was in the worst possible place where the **S outnumbered him 10-1 or more and had about 50 tanks to the Finnish army's 0 tanks. We are told he was just a messenger, but the truth was different. He was on the front lines for most of the 105 days of the Winter War in -30-degree weather. The **T troops were basically caught in a death trap. A narrow strip of land between lakes, ponds, rivers, hills, and valleys, with huge waves coming in over and over again. White landscape and brown coats. It would have been easier with the captured machine guns, bore after bore, and the damage to the **T forces was enormous. And the **T soldiers did not care one bit about their dead comrades. They were left on the battlefield, and after the war, it was the Finns who had to bury their bodies. All personal belongings were collected and delivered to the **S. So the bodies were buried in a mass grave near the border. Even then, the **S had no interest in their own soldiers. Story 48. I spent 10 years with my ex-partner. I raised his 2 children and had children with him. A year and a half after we broke up, I found out that he had an affair with the mother of my children's school. I PM'd her, and she told me that when we first started going to that school, he told me and everyone at the school that I was his live-in au pair, and that we were not a couple. So my entire community watched us live as a couple for 10 years, and no one told me he was having an affair with another mother. I worked as a teacher in school and as a counselor. No one, not even one of my friends, said a word to me about it. According to this woman, when we announced our pregnancy, she found out and packed up on him. She said she had taken the children, whom I was raising, on family picnics and outings, spent a lot of money on them, took family pictures, and spent vacations with them. He even proposed to her, in front of the children, after 4 years of dating, because the divorce was finalized. In fact, the divorce was not finalized. He was still married to his first wife. When I questioned him about it, he admitted everything and told me that they are still very close friends, that they talk every week, and that he was angry because she moved to another state when their daughter was born and he was heartbroken. For years I thought I was really naive and **D. But as I got older, I realized that it is normal to trust and love your partner, especially if you are super close to your father, uncle, or brother, and that some people are liars and filthy cheaters and do that to everyone. Story 49. Not exactly like me, but my ex-fiancé was dating a guy before me. He disgusted her and often mentally abused her for not being a virgin, having us *** toys, and other things that were considered bad in his religion. The worst part was that he cheated on her and slept with another woman who had 3 children of her own, even though he had sworn firmly that he would not have sex with her until they were married. I found out a while ago that he was AP***O. The mother of the 15-year-old posted all the screenshots he was sending her on a local town Facebook group. He was in a car accident on his motorcycle and tried to kill himself. If you're reading this from the state hospital because they allow P***s in California to have access to computers, that's freaky. Tim, you are a woman abusing, child sexualizing ***M. Story 50. It is very disturbing to me. But last year I worked with a young lady who has a 15-year-old sister who has a 35-year-old boyfriend, and she is pregnant with his child. Her mother would drive her to his house so they could be together, but the family knew his age and tolerated everything. They told everyone he was 19. CPS had been called several times by people outside of the family. CPS said he was fine. He had water and food. They are now waiting for her to turn 16.